Thank you very much, John and Carl, for having me. Thank you, dear guests, for joining us this evening. I was just chatting with Carl and John before the lecture, and I said, you know, as an economist, I grudgingly have to admit that politics is really important for development. And it is true that, you know, when one looks at so many countries, including my own, economic policy can do a lot of very important things, and it's clearly very, very crucial. But if one gets the politics wrong, if the politics derail, as we saw, for example, in ex-Yugoslavia, then even quite decent economic policies cannot really yield the results expected. So the interaction between politics and economics is crucial to development. It's crucial, of course, to the United Nations, to what we do at the United Nations. And therefore, what I'll try to do tonight is give you an overview from my own perspective, towards the end adding some personal anecdotes and experiences, but in the beginning trying to kind of share with you where I think thinking on this issue is at, the literature, the analysis, the empirical studies, what do we know, what don't we know, and then, as I said, I'll go to some more personal aspects of it. Before I start, I do want to say, however, that the United Nations Development Program is deeply involved in issues of governance, more from economic and social side than from a purely political side. Of course, it's more the political part of the United Nations, the Department for Political Affairs and so on, that deals with the purely political aspects. But we on the development side deal with the implementation of governance issues, elections, and many other aspects of democratic governance. And indeed, right now, democratic governance is the biggest part. Supporting democratic governments has become the most important part of our program. I would say about 40–45% of the resources of the UNDP are allocated to activities that support democratic governance. Statistic we often quote these days is that on average, once every 2 weeks, the UNDP, in cooperation with DPA, is involved in supporting an election somewhere around the world. Now, in terms of looking at the literature, which many of you, I'm sure, know better than I do, particularly the political scientists, there is a vast literature on the relationship between democracy and development. It starts perhaps with modernization theory, Lipset, and, you know, the thesis that as countries grow richer, as citizens are more prosperous, they demand more freedom, they demand more democracy, so the kind of causality running from development, economic growth to democracy indicators. I think with time and this was done, of course, in the late 50s, early 60s, when many countries were still colonies, and therefore the set of countries that one could analyze at that time was rather restricted. I think there still remains some validity in that causality. In other words, it is easier to sustain democratic institutions and to have well-functioning democratic institutions at a level of development that is somewhat higher. It is harder in extreme poverty and extreme underdeveloped situations. However, the last few decades have shown us that there is no tight relationship. You can have poor countries that have gone quite far in democracy and democratic participation, and you have countries that with higher income levels that are way behind on that. So that the association is not as strong as perhaps the early proponents of modernization theory would have it. There is a study also that shows that what matters is not just income level, but it's also how well you're doing relative to your existing level of income. In other words, countries that are growing, where prosperity is increasing, are able to develop democratic freedoms more easily than countries who may be richer, but where the actual prosperity levels are going down. So it's the rate of change that matters as well as the actual level. There has been a lot of interest, of course, in the other direction of causality, not from economic development to democracy, but the other way around. From political institution freedoms, democratic participation to development. The big question being, does development actually help? Does democracy actually help development? And, on that, the early thoughts and the early literature was, of course, rather negative and rather pessimistic. I think Professor Bagwati gave a lecture to this group, or to a related group rather recently, where he reminded us of what he calls the cruel dilemma, the way it was perceived in the 50s and 60s, where a predominant view among economists was that to get growth, you needed to have a high investment rate. And in order to extract that investment rate from societies that are quite poor, authoritarian regimes which forced societies to save and to invest did better than democracies where it was much more difficult to mobilize those investment funds. There was a time when one of the key textbooks in economics, Paul Samuelson's textbook, kind of said, without quite saying it in a very clear way, but implied that probably the Soviet Union would overtake the US in terms of economic welfare and prosperity. Why? Because the Soviet system extracted a huge surplus from its population, forced the population to save, and invested a lot of funds. The investment rate in the Soviet system was between 40 and 45% for decades. And, the US invests between 20 and 25% over that period. So if you make a mechanical computation with fixed productivity growth assumptions, you end up, with the societies that invest a lot growing much faster. Of course, history has shown that what is not only as important, but perhaps even more important than the investment rate per se, is the efficiency with which these resources are utilized, and the total factor productivity growth driven by innovation and entrepreneurial activity. And therefore, those models of growth that overemphasize the sheer quantity of investment ended up being very misleading, and we've had authoritarian systems ending up growing very little, or apparently growing, but then when one looked at the actual quality of the output produced, of course it fell very much short. And that's the history, in a way, of the world economy over the last few decades. We've seen very centralized and authoritarian systems not do very well at all, and much more decentralized democratic systems do much better. So the cruel dilemma of the 1950s and 60s, thankfully, wasn't a real dilemma. And the early theories that linked authoritarian regimes to higher growth rates actually fell apart. Having said that, unfortunately for Democrats, I should say, it is also not quite true to say that there is a very clear empirical association leading from democratic institutions and freedoms to better economic performance. It's not as simple. You do have quite a few examples of countries with fairly, decent democratic institutions not doing so well, or at least with apparent democratic institutions not doing so well. And you do have some authoritarian regimes who actually are doing quite well on the development axis. So if one is intellectually honest and looks at the evidence, one has to be more careful in making such statements. What does turn out to be true in terms of the evidence we have is that there is a positive association that runs from democratic institutions and democratic development to good governance, and then from good governance to better economic performance and economic growth. What's critical in that link is that we need democratic institutions and I'm not talking purely from an economic point of view. There are other considerations, but from an economic development point of view, it is very, very important that the type of democracy we have, the type of democratic participation we develop, leads to good governance, leads to the rule of law, leads to predictability in economic policies, leads to a business environment where entrepreneurs, domestic or foreign, can invest with some confidence that the rules won't change overnight. And of course, the need for security, physical security in a country. All these things are very, very important for economic development. And for democracy to foster development and to be successfully associated with good economic performance, it has to be the kind of democracy that develops that type of governance. And that is not automatic. You can widen democratic freedoms, have elections, have competitive parties and all that, and not necessarily have the good governance that's needed for good economic performance. That's what the data show, and I think there's a lot of literature now going more deeply into these issues. A few more points on the literature. One dimension that is important is that transition economies, particularly, of course, transitions from extremely centralized and authoritarian political and economic systems. When you go from such a system to more democracy and greater decentralization, that transition is very complicated and very difficult to manage, as we saw in Eastern Europe and the ex-Soviet Union space. And there are very important sequencing issues there that one has to be careful about. One particular problem, when you have a system that is deeply flawed and that has tremendous obstacles to development and to efficiency built into it, is that reform is often very costly in the beginning. Reform is an investment into the future, but like all investment, it costs you at the beginning. Or you can liken it sometimes to surgery. You know, you're chronically ill, you have a real problem, you have to have surgery. When you do have the surgery, you actually in the beginning feel worse, obviously, or immediately after the surgery, you know, you very often feel worse. And then the improvements come over time. Now, of course, if you then take, you know, the patient to a democratic election right the day after surgery or before surgery, you're not likely to get a very good result. So part of the problem of moving, you know, of reforming systems, both in the political and economic sphere, are these timing issues. And, you know, there's no obvious answer to that, but one has to keep that in mind when one evaluates the development of various systems. Another point that comes out of the literature is the importance of history and of geography. There's a recent article by Persson and Tabellini who provide some very good evidence from the past that two strong explanatory variables in terms of how a country does in terms of democratic development and the persistence of democratic freedoms is how much democracy it had in the past, how much experience of democracy it has, and second, in what kind of neighborhood it is. Both factors are strong explanatory variables. If a country has had the experience of democracy before, it tends to do much better, you know, even though there may have been a dictatorship in the meantime. When the democracy comes back, it's much more, it's quicker to adapt to it, it's quicker to be successful than countries that didn't have that experience in the past. And the same goes for neighborhoods. There are neighborhood effects that if you kind of are in a good neighborhood, quote, from a democratic point of view, it's easier also for you to implement democratic reforms and to develop democratic freedoms more deeply. I think these are the key facts that come out of the empirical literature and the theoretical literature. Very quickly, of course, it's a very complex and rich literature, but I thought it was worth highlighting these. Now, having said that, I would like to add two important caveats, two important qualifiers. First, of course, economic development is not the only reason why we want to have democracy. Democracy is a good in itself, is something positive in itself. In the UNDP literature, we call it human empowerment. It is something that's valued and valuable apart from income growth. So, you know, in analyzing the links between democracy and development, economic development, one should never forget that human empowerment is a source of happiness and of well-being in itself, even if it isn't associated with higher income levels. There are many, many studies that show how important these human empowerment variables are. Some of you may have seen the World Bank-sponsored study, Voices of the Poor, by Deepa Narayan, how important it is, for example, in the lives of poor people that they can trust the police, that they can actually go to the police station and get some help when they have a problem, instead of being afraid of the police, just to give you one example. So I don't want to sound narrowly economic when I evaluate the role of democracy in development. That's the first point. The second point, and that's a problem for empirical studies, of course, is that one has to be careful when generalizing from history. A lot of the studies deal with the last few decades. Some of them actually go back to the mid-19th century, go back 150 years. And analysts organize panel data, time series, cross-section data, and try to find these associations. But I do believe that there is actually, history moves on. And what was valid 50 years ago, even empirically valid, may be quite different today. The world changes, perception changes. What is acceptable at a particular period of history is no longer acceptable today. What works at a particular time in history may no longer work today. And I think we really have to take all these historical studies with a grain of salt, because we live today in the year 2006. We look forward to 2010, 2015, and the world 5 years from now is a very different world from 1980 or 1950. We have to remember that, because it's inherent in these empirical studies that they're backward-looking rather than forward-looking. Of course, my own country, Turkey, is perhaps worth thinking about in this context. How each historical period has its own logic and its own context. Turkey in the 1930s was a country led by an authoritarian leader who is much loved in Turkey still today, founder of the Turkish Republic. In the 1930s, it was not a multi-party democracy, but when you compare Turkey 1930 to Europe 1930s, actually Turkey was miles ahead of most European countries in terms of the rule of law, the role of parliament, the security of individual people, and things of that sort. When you compare it, to Italy at that time, Germany, most of Eastern Europe, Spain, Greece, that was Europe in the 1930s. Okay, there was France, there was UK, there was some Nordic countries, but that Europe was a very different Europe, and on many indicators, Turkey was ahead. So when you then compare that to the 1980s, of course, it's a very different story. So what I'm trying to say is that each period has its own logic, its own context, and when one analyzes things, one has to, I think, analyze them within that context. Two more points. One is the issue of markets and governments in this whole debate. And it's a big topic, and I'm not going to go into details, but when we look at the development of Western democracy, we really realize that the development of competitive markets went hand in hand with the development of strong democratic institutions. In the words of Ruggie or also Polanyi, markets were embedded in human and political institutions. They were not functioning without these political institutions. And sometimes, particularly economists, and particularly very kind of free market, extreme free market economists, sometimes forget that every successful market system in history has been embedded in strong governance. Now, when you look at the developing countries, you often miss that. You have markets that are developing, you have actually a lot of wealth in the private sector, and you have very weak governance. I was talking to our representative in Kabul the other day, and I asked, how much does a middle to high level civil servant earn in the Afghan government now? Somebody who has to either manage the provision of health services or security, or the security people are getting a little bit more, or a tax inspector or whatever. It's $50 a month, And the same goes in many African countries. How much does a director general earn? $100, $80 a month, And this is in a world where in the same countries, actually not so much in Afghanistan because of the safety problems, but the private sector actually makes considerably higher incomes. And it's very, very hard, to build up a civil administration in these countries without dealing with this capacity problem of the public administration of the civil service. And one of the consequences of that, of course, is corruption, non-transparent practices, which are one of the major obstacles, preventing good economic performance. But I would go further than that. It's what my friend Moises Naim calls illicit. In other words, the takeover of large parts of society by illegal, extra-legal mechanisms, drug cartels, drug pushers, arms salesmen, and general criminal activity. You have parts of cities, parts of countries, unfortunately, taken over by these extra legal networks. And it's one of the real difficult problems we have to face in talking about the development of democracy and of good governance. We do need, besides markets, which of course we need good markets, private sector and all that, but we have to, I think, remind ourselves that we also need strong governments, strong public administrations with decent salaries that can actually provide the judicial and legislative and governing framework for the working of decentralized market in the private sector. And I think too often we don't give enough stress to that. So one of the key I think objectives and missions of UNDP is to try to help in that, to try to help build the capacity of good governance. And also we have to face the fact that, very often donors are willing to pay for flying in consultants from abroad who rightly are paid, good salaries. They live in rich countries. That's where their living is. So they get paid a rich country salary for their good work in a developing country, but then they leave. Whereas the real need very often is to somehow increase those salaries that I mentioned a while ago, which are ridiculously low and which don't allow the capacity creation that we need in many of these countries. And this whole fight against illegality, I think, is a very serious issue that perhaps we're not addressing enough. I firmly believe many groups that appear as terrorist groups or appear political, very often what's driving them is drug money or other illicit activities, and the political clothing is really only part of it. The real driving force is often the criminal activities behind it. Last point on this whole debate is something I think is particularly important to share with an American audience, and that is that in today's interdependent world, one cannot really be a Democrat, in my view, and deeply believe in democratic values and be a proponent of democracy and try to develop democracy, unless one also thinks about the global aspects of democracy. In my recent book, I have a little quote that says, democracy, I can't remember the exact quote now, but democracy has been left, at the national border, standing there without a passport. What is meant by that quote is that so many issues in today's world are cross-boundary issues, whether it's disease, whether it's security, environmental issues. The world has to cooperate on global issues in many dimensions, on many questions. And so when we argue for the development of democracy within the boundaries of a nation state, the underlying value system, I think, that makes us argue for democracy is the respect of human rights and the equality of human beings. Basically, you can argue about the exact legislative system, electoral system. But bottom line is, if you don't have a one woman, one man, one vote system, in some sense, you can weight the votes, you can have upper chambers, senates, and all that. But the bottom line is, each human being is equal and has a vote. And that is, after all, one of the absolute key aspects of democracy. Well, if you think of it in that way, then it is very odd that in the Security Council of the United Nations, for example, the institution which has the greatest amount of power in the United Nations. India, with its 1+ billion people, 1.1 billion, I think, almost right now, and moreover, which is a democracy, so it also has the legitimacy of itself being a democracy, that India is not sitting in the Security Council. What I want to say by that is that you can't really hope for strong progress of democratic principles and values and commitments throughout the world if one isn't at the same time willing to redesign a little bit, re-equilibrate, reorder the governance of the international system so that within the international institutions, the UN, the World Bank, IMF, the developing countries, and particularly the countries with large populations who have a large stake in the international system, don't increase their weight and their say. I think this is a very important aspect of the whole debate on democracy, which we should not forget. How to do it, of course, can be debated. There's a very interesting dilemma between countries as actors in the international system, individual countries, the one country, one vote kind of thing, which of course reflects the fact that sovereign nations are still the building blocks of the international system, and therefore one has to give each sovereign nation, even though it may be very, very small, a say, a place, a certain ability to express its views. At the same time, presumably one has to take into account also the size of nations, what they contribute to global public goods, to the international system, whether it's in terms of peacekeepers, whether it's in terms of money for development or for disease control. So all these things need to be weighed. But it's clear to me that we can't live with a system designed in 1945 in 2006. And that's why I think the Secretary General's reform proposals are so important in terms of the Security Council, in terms of other aspects. We're making some progress. The Peace Building Commission, which was agreed on, enlarges in a way. It's an advisory, it doesn't have executive powers like the Security Council, but nonetheless it enlarges the membership in an important way, bringing in more actors. And I think the recent proposals by the Managing Director of the International Monetary Fund, Rodrigo Derato, to change the weights by which the countries are represented on the board of the International Monetary Fund are another step in the right direction, but it takes a long time, it's very hard, and unfortunately, I think it goes much too slowly given the pressing challenges that we have. Finally, two points from more personal experience, I think, that are relevant to this debate. One is, and in a way it comes back to governance, is the tension that exists in all systems between the need to pre-commit political actors to certain types of economic policies and the requirements of representative democracy. And I'll explain what I mean. In a way, it has to do with the division of powers, in a way, the division between the executive, the legislative, and the judiciary, but it goes beyond that. For example, when I was in Turkey as Minister of Economic Affairs, I introduced a new law in Parliament giving much greater degree, in fact, European-style autonomy, independence to the central bank. Okay? And there were many colleagues of mine in Parliament who said, but what do you mean independence of the central bank? Are they not part of the Republic of Turkey? Should they not, do what we tell them to do, we elected representatives of the people of Turkey? I mean, are you a Democrat or what? Or are you some kind of secret technocrat, sent by international institutions to infiltrate Turkish democracy? And, I can see the point. I can see the point, because sometimes when you listen to the way the IMF speaks, you kind of say, wait a minute. These technocratic institutions, be it the competition board, being the bank supervision system, being the central bank, I mean, they should be part of the democracy. They cannot just hang out there on their own with technocratic powers bestowed upon them by some law or some, extra democratic mechanism, okay? So there is obviously the need to have an overall system of democracy that is where these so-called independent economic agencies and regulatory bodies are accountable and are part of the democracy. At the same time, as we all know, looking at the developed countries in Europe and the US and Japan and so on, is that over time all these democracies have evolved economic systems, economic governance systems, where some, how shall I put it, some semi-technical institutions have a great deal of autonomy. The Federal Reserve, once the people, the board is appointed, once the head is appointed, is very autonomous both from Congress and from the presidency. Banking supervision in all developed countries have a high degree of autonomy, and indeed the terms of these regulators are much longer very often than the terms of the Congress members or even presidents who appoint them. So there is need for a very, I think, interesting equilibrium between regulatory agencies and democratic elected bodies. Now, why do we need these regulatory agencies? Because we need, as I said, we need an economic policy, we need pre-commitment capacity. We need a degree of stability in the overall framework of monetary policy, of exchange rate policy, of banking rules, which is not subject to sudden changes that maybe politics could trigger. Of course, over time, politics can change these institutions, including the personnel, including their heads, but it should take time. So this particular balance, between autonomy and democracy is a very delicate thing, which I believe, particularly when we work with much poorer countries, we have to be very careful about. We have to avoid two dangers. The one danger is to have democratic competition, take over all these bodies and basically not have the ability to have a gradual, careful economic framework that allows pre-commitment. On the other hand, I do believe also we have to be careful not to adopt a too technocratic approach, where central banks are just kind of doing their thing, following certain rules, without really being accountable to the democratic institutions in the country. And how to define that balance, in what type of country, how does it relate to the particular constitution, to the level of development of the country, I think these are things which I hope UNDP will work on very, very carefully. Final point, people ask me very often, what's the best piece of advice you got when you were asked to go and become the economic affairs minister in Turkey at the peak of a very, very tough crisis? And, I did call my friends. I didn't have that kind of experience. I'm an academic economist. I had World Bank experience, but I never had the kind of political responsibilities that I had for that period in Turkey. So, I called many friends. I asked for advice, and I got quite a lot of advice from various friends I had. But I think the best piece of advice, and one that I think is relevant to this whole debate about democracy, that I got was from the Mexican central bank governor, Guillermo Ortiz, who had been Minister of Economic Affairs, Finance in Mexico during the Mexican tequila crisis in 94, 95. And I said, Guillermo, tell me in one sentence, I have to leave tomorrow, but in one sentence, what's your advice? What lesson do you want to share with me? And he said, Kemal, if you don't spend more time in Turkey explaining what you're trying to do as an economics minister than actually sitting in your office working, you'll definitely fail. And I took this advice. I tried to take this advice to heart, and try to put it in practice, although it's quite difficult because the time pressures are terrible. But it is very, very important, I think, for economic policymakers, particularly when it relates to this whole issue of autonomy, central bank issues, and so on, to really share with civil society, with people, as much as possible, why policy is what it is, why one is conducting it, to be very transparent about it, and to take the time to sit down with civil society, with the major actors, and really try to go through the various pros and cons of what you're doing. It's not easy. Sometimes it gets misinterpreted. I remember one meeting and one dinner I had with the workers' unions, where I said, we considered all possibilities. One was to default, do an Argentina. I mean, Argentina hadn't happened yet, but maybe default on the debt. But then this wasn't good for Turkey. It would lead to greater costs and bigger burdens on working people. So and then there were and then we finally decided to do that. Of course, next day there was a headline: Dervis considering defaulting on debt. So this transparency and this dialogue with civil society is not an easy thing, but I think one really has to do it, and it helps tremendously in the sustainability of economic policies. And finally, let me read to you a few sentences from an Israeli novelist, Amos Oz, whom some of you may know, who I just read his little book the other day, and he says the following, and I think I would like to share this message with an mostly American audience. He says, "I wish the present American administration, perhaps the present generation of Americans altogether, had more carefully studied their own history. I regard the Marshall Plan not only as the single most generous move in history, the single most generous policy in history, but also the best investment anyone has ever made throughout history. It was the Marshall Plan that won the Cold War, not ray guns and Star Wars, but the Marshall Plan. I think communism was defeated through the Marshall Plan, through its overthrow, though its overthrow took 30 or 40 years more to materialize. It was Harry Truman, not Ronald Reagan, who won the war through the Marshall Plan. But what was the essence of the Marshall Plan? It meant that America helped to reconstruct civil society, a ruined society, by preventing poverty and despair." Maybe this is a little bit exaggerated, but I do believe, particularly in these days, when there's so much debate about the role of foreign aid and how you can really help and how you can help the development process and support, both economic development but also democratic development, that there are examples in history where through very peaceful means, through economic means, I think societies were helped tremendously from the outside, so I think that can happen. Much of development, of course, has to come from the inside, but outside help can work. We have more recent examples of European Union help in the Mediterranean area and in Eastern Europe working quite well in countries like Spain or Ireland or Hungary. So while in the end development is domestically driven, and it will not happen if domestic dynamism isn't there, if domestic leadership is not there. But I think outside help, particularly as Amos Oz says, focused on civil society, focused on the whole development of the society as a whole, can be tremendously helpful. I've been in situations where I saw how much money can be spent on purely military activities, for example in the Balkans, billions and tens of billions. And then when it comes to the economic side, to the social side, it's very hard sometimes to find $50 million. And I think that's really wrong. There's a great imbalance here. And if one could focus more resources, of course in an intelligent, in a balanced way, not in a mechanical way, on working with forces of reform and forces of economic progress and political progress, I think one could achieve a lot more. And then the need to spend money on security issues becomes much less. Thank you very much.
Well, that was really a magnificent tour d'horizon, and so many issues were covered. I could have listened forever. But we have some time for questions. I'm going to ask, if you ask a question, try to make it crisp and short and identify yourself, please, over in the back. And we have mics on both sides. And I think we have a floating mic, too, for people in the middle.
Mr. Dervis, I'm wondering about your views about the relationship between religion and economic development, because as we see the examples, like in the United States, like almost an Islamophobia is developing. We saw it with the port deal, Dubai port deal in the United States, as well as in your country, the last developments, the killing of a judge because of a headscarf issue, all of a sudden diminished the foreign investment in the country, the trust, the credibility, the economic stability. So I'm wondering, what do you think as the UNDP the head of the UNDP, the relationship between religion and economic development? Thank you.
Take it one by one. Yeah. All right. Well, Carl, you said you had this great tour d'horizon, but you see a topic that wasn't touched on at all. It's of course a huge topic, and again, you know, a huge literature, a huge debate, but and you know, anything to do with religion becomes quite personal also. But I think first of all, when one looks at again historical evidence, one sees regimes, you know, quite religious regimes being very repressive and totalitarian, and one sees regimes which are led by people who are deeply religious, who are also very democratic, and one sees the opposite. Nazi Germany was, you know, was not at all a religious state, was, if anything, anti-religious, and at the same time deeply totalitarian. So I don't think that there's an easy, you know, there isn't a very easy story in history. And when one looks at different religions, I think one has the same kind of story. I mean, I certainly don't believe that there is any one religion that is more likely, you know, to be conducive to deeper democracy and democratic development than another. You look at history, and you can see over the last 10, 15 centuries examples of deep repression in all kinds of religious settings, in Christian countries, in Muslim countries. You can see, on the other hand, Muslim countries with a level of tolerance and openness that was much greater at the time than what existed in Christian countries, for example. But I do, of course, believe that what we've learned through so many centuries, I think, is that the practice of religion should be a very personal affair, should be totally free, of course, in all its manifestations and in all its dimensions, but should not be mixed up with politics as such. And I really, it's my personal strong conviction that unless you have secularism defined in that way, you know, as a separation between church and state, or between mosque and state, or synagogue and state, you are likely to run into deep problems in the democracy field. So it's one thing, I think, to be religious and to practice, and of course everybody should be able to do that in the fullest form. But I do believe that for democracy there is a need to carefully observe that separation.
One in the center here, can we get a mic into the center? Is it possible? If you can come down with it maybe, or let me also suggest for people who want to ask questions, why don't you, it's probably simpler to just line up and the mic's on the side. Well, you got a mic. You got a mic.
Okay, thank you. I just wanted to ask, you mentioned at the beginning of the talk linkages between economic development and, say, democracy, economic development and governance. I'm wondering about the cultural dimension. Is there anything to the idea that there is a kind of cultural dependence on the readiness and maturity for democracy? I think of examples of, say, Cambodia at the beginning when the UN was helping it set up its transition to democracy. I think of Russia, which seems to have kind of reverted back to a slightly totalitarian state because, at least according to some, the people are not used to democracy and what it really entails. I guess my question is the cultural aspect something the UNDP wires into its programs, something that it considers, and how so?
Well, I think I did mention, you know, that there is evidence from empirical studies that the experience of democracy or forms of democratic participation in the past is a relevant predictor of how well the country will do in the democratic area now. So there is that kind of some degree of dependence on history, which is important. I'm sure many of you have read Amartya Sen's wonderful little book called The Argumentative Indian, where he shows very interestingly, how India really has a long tradition, maybe not of democracy the way we define it today, or India defines it today, but of free argument, participation, and a great deal of tolerance. There's a little chapter in the Argumentative Indian by Amartya Sen where he tells the story of the Muslim emperor, Mughal Emperor Akbar, who brought together all protagonists, including non-believers and other religions, Hindus, Christians, Jews, Muslims, always at his court, and always endlessly argued with them and had them argue things among them. How, for example, this Muslim ruler actually was extremely secular and kept saying, the religious systems are one thing, our state is another thing, and it cannot depend on any one particular religious system. So Amartya shows there that India has the advantage over others, perhaps, of having this long tradition, and therefore maybe not that surprising that India is doing so well on the democratic front. So in that sense, I think there are links between what one would call culture, but not in the Huntingtonian sense that somehow some religions, religious cultures are somehow inherently more democratic than others.
Hi. Some critics say that institutions like the UN and the IMF fail the developing world because they seek to impose solutions that draw from the top down instead of adapting to the real life and culture from the developing world, from the bottom up. What do you have to say in regards to that?
All these tough questions. Well, I do think that progress has two driving forces. I mean, it has to be domestic, it has to be also bottom up, and in that sense, anything that's totally imposed from above cannot work. But on the other hand, I don't think I would go as far as to say that there is no role for leadership in history. I think at times, usually it's at times when conditions are ripe, but nonetheless, particular leaders, can play a critical role in societies. And therefore, in those moments, there is also some top-down development, if you like. And one shouldn't completely, neglect that either. I think when it comes to outside institutions, your point is even more valid, of course, that no outside institution should feel that it can somehow impose development or teach development to a society without deep partnerships and very well-developed partnerships with these societies. However, I would like to add that, ideally, whether it's the United Nations or even the International Monetary Fund, shouldn't be looked by countries as outside institutions. After all, these are institutions, and it brings me to my global governance point, that are owned by the member countries. I think it's particularly true for the UN, and I think it's a beautiful and very valuable part of the UN that actually most countries think and believe that the UN is their organization, including in Africa, in Asia, and Latin America. In fact, that's one great advantage of the UN. So it's not that the UN is some outsider coming in, but the UN is, if you like, is the organized international community working together to share experience, resources, insights, and to help one another. That's, I think, the right way to look at it. The same should be true of the Bretton Woods institution, of the financial institutions. In a way, they're financial cooperatives, which should be there to help those who need help at a particular moment. But for that to work, and this is what I tried to say, the governance of these institutions must reflect that cooperative international spirit. It cannot be a governance where the G7 or the G1, as one country is called, simply runs them, okay? It has to be, of course, the G1 will have a certain weight, which nobody can dispute, and a certain importance, but it has to be done in that cooperative community spirit. If one succeeds in doing that, then I think the advice coming from the international institution and the help that can be made available will be much more acceptable and much more legitimate, and therefore that interaction between national reform and international advice and support can be much more productive.
Is there another question over there? Please.
Hi, I was wondering, what do you see as the specific challenges faced by post-conflict societies such as Liberia in terms of developing good democratic governance, given the fact that you do have, a tenuous peace that's somewhat stable, and there's these glimpses of democratic practices, but you still do have a deeply fractured civil society. So what do you see in terms of those type of post-conflict societies? What can these new leaders who are taking on the challenges of building good government, what can they do to kind of use government as a way to administer, foreign aid and economic development, but also bring the people back together?
The question was about, was it Liberia in particular?
But in general.
But in general?
In general.
Right, okay, post-conflict.
Yeah. Well, post-conflict, a conflict is a terrible breakdown of human society, of human interaction. And therefore, the period that comes after the conflict has challenges, has difficulties, which are much bigger in many ways than that faced by other societies. Although, I must say, sometimes a big crisis is also an opportunity. People have suffered a lot, and they want to put this suffering behind them, and are perhaps sometimes willing to do things which they weren't willing to do before. So each crisis brings with it, sometimes at least, also an important opportunity. I think, particularly in post-crisis situations, the role of the international community is very important. In post-crisis situations, you don't have very often, I mean, now in Liberia you do, but until recently you didn't. You do not have a counterpart government which really is in control of the territory, which has legitimacy, which has the backing of the country, or at least of a majority in the country. So the international community is very often in these situations asked to play a role, which is much more, how should I put it, hands-on. It's no longer really an outsider, it's almost an insider. We've seen this in Africa, but we've also seen it in Europe. In fact, as you know, Kosovo is still basically a place, a territory, probably soon a country that is under UN stewardship in a way, okay? And I think that should be a temporary phase. As soon as possible, one should of course move back to full governance. Bosnia, by the way, is the same. Many decisions in Bosnia are still taken by outsiders that are trying to help. So one should of course try to move these societies back to their own national political structure as soon as possible. But that transition is very, very delicate, and there is also the statistic that unfortunately 50% of countries that were in conflict tend to be again in conflict within a 5-year period. So that, I think, measures the importance of the challenge we face. And here, anyway, I mean, just some quick points. One is very tough to move from the humanitarian to the development phase. Because you see, in a humanitarian context, it's very important, of course, what one does, but in a way it's somewhat simpler. You have to distribute food, just distribute it to people. You have to have temporary shelter so that people don't die. Tents, whatever, earthquake in Pakistan, and so on. But you see, then once the immediate humanitarian crisis is over, you have to move from that humanitarian intervention to trying to provide jobs, trying to solve local governance problems, trying to see how to have shelter that's permanent. But then, permanent shelter means how are you going to deal with property rights, with credit issues? How much money are you going to give to one group versus the other? Very complex issues, which are more difficult to manage than the truly humanitarian part. And that's where I think we face in the UN system some of our biggest challenges, and how to move from the humanitarian to the true recovery phase. And finally, again, it's very, very important in that phase that the UN and the international community as a whole is truly perceived as neutral between the various factions. that it doesn't side with one against the other. Of course, rule of law, human rights, one has to not, one cannot side with somebody who, for example, violates human rights. But within the various ethnic and other conflicts, the importance of having that impartial approach so that everybody can trust the UN, and so that then leads to compromise solutions, which lead to elections, which lead to the kind of situation, in Liberia, where one now has a legitimately elected leader after a terrible conflict period, and now comes the very difficult task of economic development, of course, but at least we're over that hump.
We have time for one more question, and I see a hand in the front here. If we can get the mic, please. All right, well, speak up and...
Local capital market development, local municipal bond market development. We're told we see UNDP being able to play when it comes to legal, financial, and regulatory framework that will support the development of local capital markets, local bond markets, and sustainable means for financing infrastructure and also green development.
Yeah.
To let you know, there's a forum of LSE graduates like me.
I see.
Who are big supporters of this.
Okay, good. Well, I'm an LSE graduate myself, as you know.
I know.
Well, yeah, local capital access to finance, inclusive finance, whether it's bonds or other means, is of course very, very important for development. We sponsored the year of microfinance last year, and it was a very successful year where we got lots of ideas. We created a blue book of possible recommendations and so on. Now, and really, it is absolutely critical that poor people can access financial services, including just owning a bank account. Large number, I can't remember the exact percentage, but when one thinks about, it's amazing how large the percentage of people in many poor countries are that don't even have a bank account, let alone having access to credit. So there's a huge area of activity there. Which I think can be extremely productive, because there is tremendous productive potential at that level. And unless one unleashes that, if you expect everything from the big corporations or from big investors from abroad, which have an important role to play, but you certainly won't develop by that alone. Now, how to do that, how to have the institutional mechanisms is of course very difficult, and the UN is not necessarily able to provide, the kind of multitude of services, particularly not the kind of financial backstopping that private banks or the World Bank can provide. But what the UN can do, and what we are trying to do as part of the United Nations Capital Development Fund, is to work on the regulatory side, and with the very, very small microfinance institutions. We do have a little window by which we can actually provide some resources to the microfinance institutions. But in order to preserve our resources, which are very tight, we're doing it only in the very, very poorest countries. So we're not doing it in middle income, we're doing it only in the less developed countries. And the second thing that UNCDF does, it does work exactly as you say with local governments, to develop the capacity of local governments to provide the kind of overall business environment at the local level. And I'm glad you made that point and you asked that question, because just as we have this world where the global economy, global finance, multinational corporations, all that are kind of overtaking often the nation state from the global angle, we also have to remember that much of what's happening is happening at the level of the city, the region, or even the village. And that when we talk, governance and democratic governance, we have to remember that there are all these levels. We're not just talking democratic governance, national parliament, national government, cabinet, but we're talking what happens at the commune level, the regional level, the city level, and of course some cities are much larger than countries. And then, as I said, there's also the global side to this. So in today's world, when we talk governance, and I learned this very much in the European Convention when I was a member of the people who tried to formulate the European Constitution, not with much success, I have to admit, after the elections in France and the Netherlands. But the principle of subsidiarity is very important. You need levels of governance appropriate to the types of problems we're trying to deal with, You should solve local problems at the local level if you can, and then move up when problems become too complicated or go beyond that local level and go up to the global level at the end. But that multi-level architecture of governance, I think, is a huge challenge that we're facing. And so when we talk democracy, when we talk development of democracy, we have to remember we're not dealing with one level, but with many levels.
Thank you, Kemal. I first of all want to thank the audience for, I think each of the 5 questions really covered a very, very important point, which in this magnificent tour d'horizon that in a sense helped you amplify what you were getting at. And I want to thank the audience very much for helping this, what I think is a magnificent discussion. I also want to thank McGraw-Hill, which is our host tonight, in which we're going to have a reception afterwards in the adjoining room. And let me just say one other word in conclusion about Kemal Dervis and the presentation we've just had. I think one of the really most difficult problems in this complex, incredibly complex world in which we live is how you can have people who are on the one hand practitioners, leaders, people who are dealing with practical affairs, also being able to have some kind of a grasp of the theoretical literature and the complexity of all the issues that they're dealing with. I really think this is very, very rare in the world we live in today. We at the National Endowment for Democracy publish a Journal of Democracy, and the effort to try to relate thinkers with activists is extremely, extremely difficult. And tonight, you know, we had somebody dealing with the relationship of 2 subjects, democracy and development, each of which is complex in its own right, and their relationship to each other adds a level of complexity which makes it all the more difficult to deal with. And I think what we heard tonight really was very, very special. I've rarely heard a kind of a global presentation where so many different issues were dealt with, including, I might say, in conclusion, after all of the instrumental arguments were analyzed about democracy, that democracy is also something that's valuable in and of itself. Kemal Dervis is really a thinker as well as a practitioner and also a great Democrat. Thank you.
Thank you very much.